When people say that marriage is hard work, they're not kidding. I always thought I had the formula down. Be a good husband, work hard, and everything else would fall into place. That's what I believed for almost 2 decades. Now, looking back, I realize how naive I was, how blind I had been to the cracks that had been forming under the surface for years. My name is Paul, and I'm a 45-year-old accountant. My wife, Emily, and I have been together for 20 years, married for 17 of those. We have 2 kids, a teenage daughter named Sophie, and a younger son, Michael. On the outside, we were the perfect family. Emily stayed home to take care of the kids, while I provided financially. And for the longest time, I thought we were happy, content even. But recently things started to feel off. Emily was distant, more irritable than usual. At first I chalked it up to the stress of raising teenagers. Anyone with kids knows that's a whole different battlefield. But there were other signs too. She was spending more time on her phone, staying up late even after the kids were in bed, and our conversations became stilted, almost awkward. She wasn't laughing at my jokes the way she used to, and her touch, once warm and familiar, now felt like an obligation, a chore she had to get through. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, though. Maybe it was just a rough patch. Every couple has those, right? But the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't go away. It was a cold knot in my stomach, one that tightened every time I saw her smile at her phone or make up an excuse to leave the house. My mind played tricks on me, imagining scenarios I didn't want to believe. Was there someone else? Had she grown bored of our life, our routine? One night, after the kids were asleep, I tried to talk to her about it. We were in bed, the room dimly lit by the glow of the nightstand lamp. I turned to her, feeling the weight of the words I was about to say. "Em, is everything okay between us?" She looked at me, startled, as if I had caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It just feels like you've been distant. Like there's something on your mind." She sighed, a sound that felt too heavy for the small space we shared. "It's nothing, Paul. Just stressed, that's all." I wanted to believe her, but the way she said it felt too rehearsed, too convenient. "Are you sure? I mean, if there's something bothering you, we can talk about it." She turned away from me then, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "I'm fine. Really, just drop it." And that was it. The conversation ended, leaving me more unsettled than before. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. I started questioning everything: our marriage, my role in it, and whether I had been too absorbed in work, too complacent to notice the distance growing between us. The worst part was that I couldn't pinpoint when things had started to change. Was it gradual? Had she always felt this way and I was just too blind to see it? Or was it something new? Something that had crept into our lives when I wasn't paying attention? The doubts gnawed at me, day and night, until I felt like a stranger in my own home. One afternoon, while I was supposed to be working from home, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a photo of us from our honeymoon. We looked so young, so happy. I remember how excited we were about the future, about building a life together. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, that whatever we had built was slowly crumbling away. It wasn't long after that when I started noticing more red flags. Emily would go out more frequently, claiming she needed some me time, which, in all fairness, I understood. But she'd come back hours later, smelling like perfume that wasn't hers, her hair tousled in a way that didn't match her story of a quiet evening at the cafe. I wanted to trust her. I really did. But it was getting harder to ignore the signs. There was one evening that stands out in my memory. It was a Friday, and Emily had gone out again, saying she was meeting some old friends from college. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the unease building inside me. I tried to distract myself by watching a movie with Sophie and Michael, but my mind kept wandering back to Emily. When she finally came home, it was late, almost midnight. She walked in, her smile a little too bright, her laugh a little too forced. I asked her how her night was, and she gave me a vague answer about catching up with friends. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? Or was it just my imagination? "Did you have fun?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Yeah, it was nice, she replied, but her voice had a tightness to it, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. I didn't press further, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. I watched her as she went upstairs to take a shower, and that's when I noticed it. The faint red mark on her neck, just below her ear. A mark that wasn't there when she left the house. My heart sank, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't say anything that night. I just laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the thoughts swirling in my head. Maybe it was nothing, just a coincidence, but the doubts wouldn't leave me alone. I could feel the walls closing in, the distance between us becoming an insurmountable chasm. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew something was terribly wrong. And that's how it all started. The slow unraveling of the life I thought I knew, the beginning of the end. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The next few days after that Friday night were a blur of anxiety and suspicion. Emily's behavior only fueled my growing unease. She became more secretive, guarding her phone like it was some sort of holy relic, always keeping it face down whenever I was around. She'd leave the room to take calls, her voice dropping to a whisper whenever she answered. The changes were too obvious to ignore, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront her directly. What if I was wrong? What if it really was just stress, and I was jumping to conclusions? I kept telling myself to wait, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but that gnawing feeling wouldn't go away. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Emily was out again, this time with another excuse. Something about meeting a friend to discuss a charity event. The whole thing felt off from the start. She was dressed too nicely. Her makeup was done with more care than usual, and she wore a dress I hadn't seen her wear in months. As I watched her leave, I felt a mixture of anger and fear bubbling up inside me, but I knew I needed proof, something concrete before I could confront her. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. It was one of those decisions that feels wrong as you're doing it, but at the same time, you know there's no other way. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and slipped out the door, careful not to make any noise. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from my chest as I got into my car. I had no idea where she was going, but I knew the general direction she'd taken, so I drove slowly, scanning the streets for any sign of her. After about 10 minutes, I spotted her car parked outside a small, upscale restaurant on the other side of town. It wasn't the kind of place you'd go to casually meet a friend. My heart pounded as I pulled into a parking spot a few spaces down, far enough away that she wouldn't notice me. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching the entrance like a hawk. It didn't take long for her to appear, and she wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat as I saw her with him. A man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and had that easy confidence that made me instantly hate him. They walked out together, her arm linked with his, laughing as if they didn't have a care in the world. I felt a cold, hollow pit open up in my stomach as I watched them. This was it, the proof I'd been dreading. There was no mistaking the intimacy between them, the way she looked at him with a smile that used to be reserved for me. I felt a rage boiling up inside me, something primal and uncontrollable. Every ounce of restraint I had was being tested as I watched them get into his car. I wanted to storm over there, rip her away from him, and demand answers. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to know where they were going, needed to see the truth with my own eyes. So I followed them. Again. They drove for a while, eventually stopping at a hotel. A hotel I knew well because it was one we had stayed at for a weekend getaway a few years ago. The memories of that time, of us being so close and happy, flashed through my mind like a cruel joke. I parked a few spots away and watched as they got out of the car, walking hand in hand into the lobby. My vision blurred with tears of anger and betrayal, but I blinked them away, focusing on the task at hand. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I waited in the car for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes or so. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had she been meeting him here for months, years even? The pain was overwhelming, but it fueled my determination. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure this man, this intruder in my life, knew exactly what he had done. When I finally saw them exit the hotel, I felt a sickening mix of relief and fury. They looked too comfortable, too familiar with each other, and it confirmed every horrible suspicion I'd had. I waited until they were about to get into the car before stepping out of my own, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached them. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice rough and trembling with anger. She froze, turning to face me, her eyes wide with shock. The man beside her looked confused at first, but that quickly turned to wariness as he realized what was happening. "Paul, what are you doing here?" Emily stammered, her face going pale. "What the fuck do you think I'm doing here?" I spat, closing the distance between us. "I'm here because you're a fucking liar, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes." The man stepped forward, trying to position himself between us. "Hey, calm down, man. Let's talk about this." "Talk!" I laughed bitterly, my eyes narrowing as I sized him up. "You think I want to talk to you, you piece of shit?" Before he could say anything else, I lunged at him. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the months of pent-up frustration, or maybe it was the sheer audacity of him standing there trying to defend himself. Either way, I wasn't interested in hearing anything he had to say. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling back into the side of his car. Emily screamed, but I didn't care. I was done playing nice, done pretending like everything was okay. The man recovered quickly, swinging back at me, but his punch barely grazed my shoulder. I retaliated with another hit to his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He doubled over, gasping for breath, and I seized the opportunity to grab him by the collar, shoving him up against the car. "Do you even know who you're fucking with?" I growled, my face inches from his. "You think you can just waltz into my life and take what's mine?" "Paul, stop!" Emily cried, grabbing my arm, trying to pull me off him. But I wasn't listening. I was too far gone, too consumed by the red haze of rage. I shoved the guy harder, slamming him against the car again. I wanted him to feel the pain I was feeling, to understand the depth of the betrayal he had caused. "Paul, please." Emily was practically begging now, tears streaming down her face. I finally released him, watching as he crumpled to the ground, coughing and wheezing. I turned to Emily, my chest heaving with each labored breath. "How long, Emily? How fucking long has this been going on?" She didn't answer at first, just stood there, trembling. The guilt in her eyes was all the confirmation I needed. "How long?" I demanded again, my voice raw. "A few months," she whispered, barely audible. "A few months?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "A few fucking months and you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think I deserved to know?" "I'm sorry," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen," I echoed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "You're a liar, Emily. You lied to me, to our kids. How could you do this?" She didn't answer, just cried harder, her shoulders shaking with each sob. I looked down at the man on the ground, who was finally starting to pull himself together. I wanted to hit him again, wanted to make him pay for every second of pain I was feeling, but I didn't. I stepped back, breathing heavily, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. "You're lucky I didn't kill you," I muttered to him before turning back to Emily. "We're done. Don't come home tonight. I can't even look at you." With that, I walked away, leaving them both standing there, stunned and broken. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe I'd drive around until I could think straight. Maybe I'd just find a bar and drown out the pain with a few stiff drinks. All I knew was that my life had just been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. I don't remember much of the drive after leaving Emily and her lover in that parking lot. The world outside the car window blurred as my mind replayed everything I had just witnessed. Her tears, his smug face, the way they clung to each other. It was like a horror movie on a loop. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, my thoughts spiraling into a dark, chaotic mess. How could she do this? How could she throw away everything we had for some fling? Eventually, I found myself parked outside our house, the place that was supposed to be our sanctuary, our home. But now it felt like a tomb, filled with memories of a life that had been nothing but a lie. I sat there for a long time staring at the front door, wondering if I had the strength to walk through it. I didn't. Instead, I drove to a nearby park, the one where we used to take the kids when they were younger. It was late, almost midnight, and the place was deserted. I got out of the car and wandered aimlessly, the cool night air doing little to soothe the burning anger inside me. I ended up sitting on a bench, the same one where Emily and I had sat years ago, watching Sophie take her first steps. The memory made my chest ache. How had we gone from that to this? Hours passed, and I knew I couldn't stay away forever. The kids would be home soon, and I needed to be there for them. So I drove back, each mile feeling heavier than the last. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Emily's car was parked outside. A part of me had hoped she wouldn't come back, that she'd just disappear and save us both the pain of what was about to happen. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. This confrontation was inevitable. I walked through the front door, and there she was, sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The sight of her like that didn't soften me like it used to. Instead, it fueled the rage that had been simmering inside me all night. "Paul," she started, her voice trembling, "please, let's talk." "Talk?" I spat, slamming the door behind me. "What the fuck is there to talk about, Emily? You've been fucking some guy for months and you expect me to just sit down and have a conversation?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I was past caring. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. "How long?" I demanded, stepping closer to her. "How long have you been seeing him?" She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously in her lap. 2 months, she whispered. 2 months? I echoed, my voice rising. You've been sneaking around behind my back for 2 fucking months? How could you do this to me, to our family? "I'm sorry," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Bullshit," I snapped, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew the moment you started seeing him that it would destroy us." "It wasn't like that," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I was lonely, Paul. You were always working, always too busy for me. I didn't know how to reach you anymore. Don't you dare try to blame this on me," I growled, taking another step towards her. "I was working to provide for this family, to give you and the kids a good life. And this is how you repay me?" She shook her head, sobbing harder now. "It wasn't about you. It was about me. I felt lost, disconnected. I didn't know who I was anymore, and he made me feel seen." "Seen?" I repeated, the word like poison on my tongue. "So what? I wasn't enough for you? You needed some asshole to validate you, to make you feel important?" "No, that's not it," she pleaded, reaching out to me, but I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. "I love you, Paul. I never stopped loving you." "Don't say that," I hissed, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Don't you fucking say that, Emily. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have torn our family apart." She crumpled, collapsing onto the couch as her sobs racked her body. I watched her, my heart a twisted knot of anger, betrayal, and a sliver of the love I once felt for her. But that love was buried so deep beneath the layers of hurt that I couldn't reach it, couldn't find it in myself to forgive her. "How many times?" I asked, my voice cold and detached. "How many times did you fuck him?" She looked up at me, her face pale, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she did, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. "5, she whispered. "It happened 5 times. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. 5 times. 5 times she had chosen him over me, over us. 5 times she had betrayed everything we had built together." "And where did you do it?" I demanded, needing to know every sordid detail, no matter how much it would hurt. "Hotels," she admitted, her voice shaking. Sometimes at his place." "In our house?" I asked, the thought making my stomach churn. "Did you bring him here?" She shook her head frantically. "No, never. I wouldn't do that." "Gee, thanks for that," I said sarcastically, my anger flaring up again. "Real fucking considerate of you." "Paul, please," she begged, getting up from the couch and taking a step toward me. "I know I've hurt you, but I want to fix this. I want us to work through this, to be a family again." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. How could she be so delusional, so selfish, to think that I could ever forgive her for this? "Fix this?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "There's nothing left to fix, Emily. You broke us. You broke me. And for what? Some guy who made you feel good about yourself? I hope it was worth it." She crumbled again, sinking to her knees as she sobbed. but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The sight of her, the sound of her crying, only made me angrier. "Do the kids know?" I asked, my voice low. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "They don't know anything." "Good," I said, my voice hard. "Because they're not going to. You're going to leave tonight. And you're not coming back until I figure out what the hell to do next." "But where will I go?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't care," I snapped. "Go to your lover's place for all I care. Just get out of my sight." She hesitated, looking like she wanted to argue, but then she slowly nodded, defeated. She stood up and walked to the door, her movements slow like she was in a daze. As she opened the door, she turned back to me, her face full of pain. "I'm sorry, Paul," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really am." I didn't respond, just stood there, watching as she left. The moment the door closed behind her, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. The reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a tidal wave, and for the first time since finding out about the affair, I let myself cry. The tears came hard and fast, years of love and betrayal spilling out as I finally let go of the anger, if only for a moment. When the tears finally stopped, I was left with an emptiness so vast it felt like it would swallow me whole. I sat there, staring at the darkened room, trying to make sense of the mess that my life had become. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see a way forward. All I could see was the wreckage of a marriage that I had thought was unbreakable, now lying in ruins around me. And somewhere in the midst of that darkness, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The house felt like a hollow shell after Emily left that night. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind cycling through a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, sorrow, confusion, and a deep, simmering need for something more than just answers. I wanted to hurt her the way she had hurt me, to make her feel the depth of the betrayal she had inflicted on our family. The idea of revenge wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a lifeline, something to cling to in the midst of the storm that had become my life. I finally stood up, my body moving on autopilot as I went upstairs to our bedroom. The bed, still unmade from the morning, looked foreign to me now. A place where we had shared so many intimate moments, now tainted by the memory of her betrayal. I walked over to her side of the bed and sat down, staring at the nightstand where she kept her phone, her jewelry, and other personal items. Her phone was still there. She had left it behind in her haste to get out of the house. Part of me didn't want to touch it, but the other part, the part that had been wounded and humiliated, wanted to see what else she had been hiding. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling slightly as I unlocked it. The screen lit up, revealing a slew of notifications. Texts, missed calls, and app alerts. Most of them were from the man she had been seeing, and just seeing his name made my blood boil all over again. I opened the messages, scrolling through their conversations, my heart pounding as I read each word. There were no new revelations, just more of the same sickening exchanges full of sweet nothings and plans for their next rendezvous. But one thing caught my attention. In one of the messages, she mentioned a necklace he had given her, something she wore whenever they met. I vaguely remembered seeing a new necklace in her jewelry box a few weeks ago, something I had assumed was just a little treat she had bought for herself. But now, knowing the truth, the thought of her wearing it during their meetings made me want to smash the damn thing into a million pieces. I put the phone down, my hands shaking with barely contained fury. I needed to do something, anything to channel this anger. Sitting here, wallowing in my pain, wasn't going to cut it. I wasn't just going to let her walk away from this unscathed. My eyes landed on her wardrobe, the door slightly ajar. Without thinking, I yanked it open, the hinges creaking in protest. Her clothes were neatly hung up, organized the way she always liked them. Dresses on one side, blouses and skirts on the other. I grabbed a handful of them and threw them onto the floor, the fabric crumpling under my grip. It felt good, in a twisted sort of way, to destroy something she cared about, something she had taken pride in. But it wasn't enough. I marched downstairs to the kitchen, grabbed a pair of scissors from the drawer, and went back up to the bedroom. Without hesitation, I started cutting through the fabric, the blades slicing through silk and cotton with satisfying ease. Dress after dress, top after top. Nothing was spared. By the time I was done, the floor was littered with shredded clothes, a pile of ruined memories. My breathing was ragged, my hands sore from gripping the scissors so tightly. I looked down at the mess I had made, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily had taken so much from me, from us, and now I was taking something back, no matter how small or petty it might seem. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Next, I went to the bathroom, where she kept all her makeup, her skincare products, her perfumes. Each item was a reminder of how she had meticulously crafted her appearance for someone else, someone who wasn't me. The thought made my stomach turn. I swept everything off the counter into a trash bag, ignoring the clatter as bottles and tubes hit the bottom. The perfumes, those I smashed against the tiles, the glass shattering on impact, the scents mingling in the air, too strong, too sickly sweet. The house reeked of perfume, a cloying reminder of her deceit. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to stop, not until I felt like I had taken something back, some measure of control over a life that had spun so wildly out of my grasp. I moved on to the bedroom again, grabbing the framed photos from the nightstands and the walls. Photos of us, of our family, of moments that were supposed to be precious. I ripped them out of their frames, tearing them apart with my hands, the paper shredding easily between my fingers. The sound was satisfying, like the crackling of fire, consuming everything in its path. By the time I was done, the bed was covered in torn photos, pieces of our life together scattered like confetti. But there was still more I could do. I went back downstairs to the kitchen, pulling out the wine glasses we had bought together, the ones we used on special occasions. One by one, I dropped them into the sink, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the empty house. I could feel the anger coursing through my veins, fueling me, pushing me to destroy anything that reminded me of her, of us. The sound of destruction was cathartic, each crash and break a release of the pain that had been festering inside me. Finally, I went into the garage, where she kept the car I had bought her for her birthday last year. A shiny new SUV, something she had wanted for months. It was her pride and joy, and I knew that hurting it would hurt her. I grabbed a hammer from the tool chest, the weight of it heavy in my hand, and walked over to the car. Without a second thought, I brought the hammer down on the hood, the metal denting under the force of the blow. The sound was loud, satisfying, and I didn't stop there. I smashed the windshield, the side mirrors, the headlights, each blow more forceful than the last. By the time I was done, the car was unrecognizable, a battered mess that mirrored the wreckage of our marriage. I dropped the hammer, my chest heaving with exertion, and stepped back to admire my handiwork. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. Emily had taken so much from me, from us, and now I had taken something back. I stood there in the garage for a long time, the adrenaline slowly draining from my body. The reality of what I had done started to sink in, but I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel remorse. All I felt was a cold, numb satisfaction that she was going to come home and see the consequences of her actions, see the destruction she had caused, both inside and out. When I finally walked back into the house, the silence felt different. It wasn't suffocating anymore. It was calm, peaceful even, like the calm after a storm. I went upstairs to the guest room. There was no way I could sleep in our bed tonight, not after everything, and collapsed onto the mattress, my body exhausted, but my mind finally at ease. As I drifted off to sleep, I knew this was just the beginning. The destruction I had caused tonight was only a small taste of what I had planned for her. She had shattered my world, and now, it was my turn to shatter hers. Tomorrow, I'd deal with the fallout. Tomorrow, I'd make her face the consequences of her betrayal. But for tonight, I allowed myself to rest, knowing that I had taken the first step toward reclaiming the power she had stolen from me. The next morning, I woke up in the guest room, the weight of the previous night's events pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. The room was dim, the curtains barely letting in any light, and for a moment I considered staying in bed, ignoring the world outside. But I knew I couldn't. There was still so much left to do, so many loose ends to tie up. I dragged myself out of bed, feeling the ache in my muscles from the rage-fueled destruction I had unleashed the night before. As I made my way downstairs, the aftermath of my rampage greeted me. A mess of broken glass, torn photos, and the stench of spilled perfume still lingering in the air. It was a stark reminder of the depth of my anger, and I felt no remorse as I looked around. Emily had brought this on herself. But there was one more person who needed to face the consequences. Her lover. The man who had thought he could waltz into my life and take what was mine. He had been a shadowy figure in this entire mess. Someone I didn't know, didn't care to know, but who had somehow managed to upend my entire existence. The thought of him, of his smug face, of the messages he had sent to my wife, made my blood boil all over again. It wasn't enough to destroy the things that mattered to Emily. I needed to confront him, to make sure he understood the gravity of what he had done. He needed to feel the full weight of the betrayal he had been a part of. I spent the next hour gathering information, trying to piece together whatever I could find about him. I went through Emily's phone again, searching for any clues that might lead me to him. There were no addresses or obvious contact details, but there were enough breadcrumbs, mentions of his workplace, snippets of conversations that gave me a rough idea of where he might be. It was all I needed. After a quick shower, I got dressed, the routine movements grounding me, preparing me for what I had to do. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed how tired I looked. Dark circles under my eyes, a shadow of stubble on my face. I wasn't the same man I had been just a few days ago. This whole ordeal had changed me, hardened me in ways I hadn't anticipated. But I wasn't going to back down now. I drove across town to the address I had pieced together from Emily's conversations. It was a commercial building, nothing special. The kind of place where people worked 9-to-5 jobs, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding in other people's lives. I parked across the street, watching the entrance, waiting for him to show up. It didn't take long. I recognized him immediately as he walked out of the building. The same man who had been with Emily the night before. He was dressed casually, his hair neatly styled, his demeanor relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. It made me sick to my stomach. How could he be so unaffected, so at ease, when he had played a part in tearing apart my family? I got out of the car, my heart pounding as I crossed the street and approached him. He didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in his phone, probably texting someone about his day. But when I was just a few feet away, he looked up, and recognition flickered in his eyes. "Hey," he started, his voice tinged with confusion. "You're Paul," I finished for him, my voice cold and steady. "Emily's husband." The shock on his face was almost satisfying. Almost. He stammered, trying to find the right words. "Look, man, Save it," I cut him off, not interested in hearing whatever excuse he had prepared. "I'm not here to talk. I'm here to make sure you understand what you've done." He swallowed hard, his confidence wavering as he realized I wasn't here for a friendly chat. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he said, taking a step back, as if putting some distance between us would somehow lessen the impact of what he had done. "It just happened. It just happened," I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "You think that justifies it? You think that makes it okay?" He didn't respond, just stood there, his eyes darting around, probably looking for an escape route. But there was no way out for him, not this time. "You walked into my life," I continued, my voice low and menacing. "You took what wasn't yours, and you think you can just walk away without consequences? Look, I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" I snapped, taking a step closer, forcing him to look me in the eye. "Didn't know she was married? Didn't know she had a family? Or did you just not care?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. "You knew," I said, my voice cold. "You knew exactly what you were doing, and you didn't give a damn about who you were hurting in the process." He was silent, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. But there was no getting out of it. Not for him. Not for Emily. They had both made their choices, and now they were going to have to live with the consequences. "I'm not going to make this easy for you," I said, my voice steely. "You've got two options. The first one is you disappear from our lives. I don't care where you go, but you never contact her again. You don't text, you don't call, You don't even think about her. If I even get a whiff that you're still in the picture, I'll make sure you regret it." He nodded frantically, relief flooding his face as he realized I wasn't going to escalate the situation into something physical. "What's the second option?" he asked, his voice trembling. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "The second option? You don't want to find out." His eyes widened, and he swallowed hard, clearly terrified. "I'll take the first option," he blurted out, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear I'll stay away from her. You'll never hear from me again." "Good," I said, stepping back, satisfied that I had made my point. "Now get out of here before I change my mind." He didn't need to be told twice. He turned on his heel and walked away as fast as he could without breaking into a run, disappearing around the corner and out of sight. I watched him go, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. It wasn't the cathartic release I'd been hoping for, but it was something. At least now, I knew he was out of the picture. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. It was over. I had confronted him, made sure he understood that there would be no second chances, no easy way out. He had messed with the wrong person, and now he knew it. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, that no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to punish them, the damage had already been done. Emily's betrayal, his involvement, it was all too much to process. The anger, the hurt, the overwhelming sense of loss, it was all still there, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. I drove home in silence, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The house was still a mess when I walked through the door, the evidence of my anger strewn about. But I didn't have the energy to clean it up. I was too tired, too emotionally drained to care about anything else. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours. Everything had changed so quickly, so drastically, and I was left reeling, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a way forward. I was stuck, trapped in this nightmare, with no idea how to wake up. As the day turned into night, I knew that there were still so many questions left unanswered, so many decisions left to make. But for now, all I could do was wait. Wait for Emily to come back, wait for the inevitable confrontation that would come next. And as much as I hated it, as much as I wanted to push it all away, I knew that I couldn't avoid it forever. The time would come when we would have to face each other again, to confront the reality of what our marriage had become. But that would be tomorrow. Tonight, I let the exhaustion take over, closing my eyes and letting the darkness pull me under, into a restless sleep, haunted by the memories of what once was and the painful reality of what now is. The next morning, the house was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The mess I had created the night before still surrounded me. Shredded clothes, broken glass, and the lingering scent of perfume hanging heavy in the air. It was a stark reminder of how far things had fallen, how deeply everything had been broken. I didn't have the energy to clean it up, nor did I want to. The wreckage felt fitting, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil raging inside me. I knew what had to happen next. There was no going back, no pretending that things could ever be the same. As much as it hurt, as much as I wanted to hold on to the life we had built, it was over. Emily had made her choices, and now it was time to make mine. The only thing left to do was have the conversation we had both been avoiding. The conversation about what came next, about ending our marriage. I spent the morning in a haze, going through the motions of getting dressed, making coffee, and staring blankly out the window as I tried to gather the strength to face what was coming. The kids were at school, and for that I was grateful. They didn't need to be around for this, didn't need to see the final unraveling of our family. It was close to noon when I heard the front door open. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Emily. I could feel her presence, the familiar energy she brought with her, now tinged with tension and dread. She walked into the kitchen, stopping just inside the doorway, as if unsure whether she was welcome. "Paul," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "We need to talk." I turned to face her, taking in the sight of her standing there, looking small and broken in a way I hadn't seen before. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair disheveled, and there was a weariness in her posture that mirrored my own. "I know," I replied, my voice flat, devoid of the anger that had consumed me the night before. There was no need for anger now, just a cold, hard acceptance of what needed to be done. She walked over to the table, sitting down across from me. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between us. I watched her, waiting for her to speak, to say something that would somehow make sense of the mess we were in. But she didn't. She just stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting the ring on her finger. The ring that had once symbolized our love, our commitment to each other. "I'm sorry, Paul," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry." I nodded, though her apology felt hollow. Sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't undo the betrayal, didn't heal the wounds that had been inflicted. "I know you are," I replied, my voice steady but cold. "But that doesn't change what happened." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered, "and I know that I've destroyed everything. I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my tone firm. "You hurt me, Emily. You hurt all of us." Her tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to argue with the truth of my words. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I said, the finality of the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "It's too late for that." She looked at me, her expression one of desperation. "So what now? What do we do?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to say. "We end it, Emily. We get a divorce." She flinched at the word as if I had physically struck her. For a moment I thought she was going to argue, to beg me to reconsider, but she didn't. She just nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Is that what you really want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what I want," I replied, my voice softening slightly. "But it's what needs to happen. There's no way forward for us after this." She wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly as she absorbed my words. "I guess I knew this was coming," she said, her voice shaky. "But hearing you say it, it makes it real." "It is real," I said, my tone firm. "This isn't just something we can sweep under the rug and pretend never happened. We have to face the consequences of our actions." "What about the kids?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "What do we tell them?" "We'll tell them the truth," I said, though the thought of that conversation filled me with dread. That we're separating, that it's not their fault, and that we both love them very much. She nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I don't want to hurt them," she said, her voice trembling. "They don't deserve this." "No, they don't," I agreed, my own voice tight with emotion. "But they deserve the truth, and they deserve parents who are honest with them, who can put their needs first." Emily wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "What do you want to do about custody?" she asked, her voice tentative. "They should stay with you," I said, the decision already made in my mind. "They need their mother. I'm not going to take them away from you." She looked at me, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You really think that's best?" "Yes," I replied, my voice firm. "I'll be around, of course. I'm not abandoning them. But I think it's important that they have some stability, and staying with you will give them that." She nodded slowly, her expression a mix of relief and sadness. "Thank you, Paul. I know this isn't easy." "No, it's not," I agreed, my voice heavy. "But it's what needs to happen." We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us absorbing the reality of what we had just agreed to. The finality of it, the weight of it, settled over us like a thick fog, suffocating and cold. This was it. The end of our marriage, the end of the life we had built together. "I'll start looking for a place to stay," Emily said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I'll move out as soon as I can." "You don't have to rush," I said, though the thought of living under the same roof as her, even for a short time, made my stomach churn. "We'll figure it out." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "I'm so sorry, Paul," she whispered, her voice breaking again. "I never wanted this." "I know," I said, my tone softening slightly. "But it's too late to change it now." She didn't respond, just sat there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to feel something. Anger, sadness, even pity. But all I felt was a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. I was tired of fighting, tired of the pain, tired of everything. "I'll tell the kids tonight," I said, standing up from the table. "We'll do it together." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, needing to put some distance between us, needing to clear my head. As I walked through the house, the mess of the previous night still surrounding me, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, suffocating me. This was the end. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken. Our marriage was over, and now we had to figure out how to move forward, how to rebuild our lives separately. The thought was terrifying, but it was also the only option left. I made my way to the backyard, needing the fresh air, the open space to clear my mind. I sat down on the porch steps, staring out at the garden we had planted together, the one thing that still seemed untouched by the chaos that had overtaken our lives. The flowers were in full bloom, a riot of color against the green backdrop, and for a moment I let myself get lost in the sight, in the memory of happier times. But those times were gone, and it was time to let go. As I sat there, the sun warm on my face, I made a silent promise to myself, to the kids, to the life we had once shared. I would do everything I could to make this transition as smooth as possible for them, to ensure that they knew they were loved, that they were the most important thing in our lives. No matter how much pain Emily had caused me, the kids would always come first. This was the end of one chapter, but it wasn't the end of the story. Life would go on, and somehow, we would all find a way to move forward, to heal. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it would happen. And that was the only thing that kept me going as I sat there, letting the reality of my new life sink in. The weeks that followed our decision to divorce were a blur of legal paperwork, difficult conversations, and the slow unraveling of the life Emily and I had built together. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and family, now felt like a courtroom, a place where every interaction was tinged with the gravity of what was to come. We kept our promise to tell the kids together. That night, after dinner, we sat them down in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Sophie and Michael, still too young to fully grasp the complexities of adult relationships, looked at us with wide, questioning eyes, sensing that something was very wrong. Emily spoke first, her voice trembling as she tried to explain the situation in terms they could understand. "Mommy and Daddy love you both very much," she began, her eyes filling with tears. "But sometimes, even when people love each other, they realize that they can't stay together the way they used to." Sophie, being older, understood immediately. Her face crumpled as she realized what was happening. "Are you getting divorced?" she asked, her voice small and scared. I nodded, my heart breaking as I watched the impact of our words hit her. "Yes, sweetheart, we are," I said gently. "But that doesn't change how much we love you. We'll both still be here for you, always." Michael, younger and more innocent, didn't fully understand. He just looked between the two of us, confusion clouding his expression. "Does that mean we won't all live together anymore?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily shook her head quickly, reaching out to pull him into her arms. "No, baby. You'll still live here with Mommy. And Daddy will come to see you all the time. You'll have 2 homes where you're loved." It was the hardest conversation I had ever had, and it broke me to see the pain in their eyes, to know that we were the cause of it. But there was no turning back now. The decision had been made, and all we could do was try to make this as easy as possible for them, to reassure them that they were still our top priority. Once the initial shock had worn off, the practicalities of divorce began to take center stage. Emily and I both knew that we needed to formalize our separation legally, to make sure everything was done properly for the sake of the kids. The divorce process was something I had dreaded, but it was unavoidable. We had to face it, no matter how painful it was going to be. We hired lawyers, separate ones, as was necessary, and the negotiations began. The house, our savings, the custody arrangements, the visitation schedule. It all had to be sorted out, and it had to be done with the children's best interests in mind. The court proceedings themselves were a cold, sterile affair, far removed from the warmth of the life we had once shared. We met in a small, impersonal courtroom, our lawyers by our sides, while a judge presided over the dismantling of our marriage. It was surreal. hearing the legal jargon, the clinical terms used to describe the end of a relationship that had once been filled with so much love and promise. Emily and I had agreed on most things before stepping into the courtroom. We didn't want to drag this out, didn't want to make it more painful than it already was. The house would remain hers. It was better for the kids to stay in the home they knew, the one place that still felt safe and familiar. We'd split the savings, with a portion set aside for the kids' future. As for custody, it was clear that they would live with her, and I would have generous visitation rights. When it came time to discuss the custody arrangements, the judge asked us both if we were in agreement with the proposed plan. Emily spoke first, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe this is the best arrangement for our children." I nodded, echoing her sentiment. "I agree, Your Honor. We want to make sure that our kids are as unaffected by this as possible." The judge, an older man with a kind but firm demeanor, looked between us, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer. "Mr. Parker, you understand that this arrangement means your children will primarily reside with their mother, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice clear. I trust Emily to take care of them, and I'll be there for them as much as possible." The judge nodded, seeming satisfied with our responses. It's always a tragedy when a marriage ends, especially when children are involved. But I'm glad to see that the two of you are prioritizing their well-being. That's what's most important. He then turned to the lawyers, instructing them to finalize the paperwork. It was all so formal, so final. In a matter of minutes, our marriage, something that had taken years to build, was legally dissolved. The judge announced his decision, granting the divorce and approving the custody agreement we had reached. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the proceedings, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was done. There was no more uncertainty, no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. The legal aspect was over, and now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces and try to build something new out of the wreckage. Emily and I left the courtroom separately, our lawyers staying behind to sort out the final details. I walked out into the bright daylight, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a deep, aching emptiness. This was the end of one chapter of my life, and the beginning of another, one that I hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted, but now had to face. I found myself wandering to a nearby park, the same one where I had sat alone after discovering Emily's betrayal. It felt like a full-circle moment, returning to the place where it had all started to unravel. I sat down on the same bench, watching the world go by, trying to process everything that had just happened. As much as I hated to admit it, there was a part of me that was grateful the court proceedings had gone as smoothly as they did. Divorce could have been a bitter, drawn-out battle, with both of us fighting over every little detail. But we had managed to avoid that, had managed to keep our focus on the kids, on what was best for them. Emily and I weren't friends, and I didn't know if we ever would be again. But we were still parents, still tied together by the children we had brought into this world. That bond couldn't be broken, no matter how much pain had passed between us. And as much as I wanted to hate her for what she had done, I couldn't. The anger had burned out, leaving behind only a deep, weary sadness. I sat in the park for a long time, thinking about the future, about what came next. The legal battle was over, but the emotional one was just beginning. I had to find a way to move on, to rebuild my life, to find a new path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but I had to try. If not for myself, then for my kids. They deserved a father who was strong, who could show them that life didn't end just because something terrible happened, that even in the midst of pain, there was always a way to find hope, to find happiness again. Eventually, I got up and started the walk back to my car, feeling the weight of the day settling on my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet foresee. But I knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write on my own terms. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that the future held something brighter, something better, than the past I was leaving behind. In the days following the court's decision, a strange sense of calm settled over my life. The divorce was final, the custody arrangements were set, and the legal battles were behind me. It was over. But with that finality came an unfamiliar emptiness, like standing on the edge of a vast, open landscape with no clear direction. Everything that had defined me for the past 2 decades, my marriage, my role as a husband, was now part of the past, a chapter closed. I moved out of the house shortly after the court hearing, leaving behind the place where we had built so many memories. The kids stayed with Emily, just as we had agreed. The day I packed up my belongings and drove away for the last time, it felt like I was shedding an old skin, leaving behind a life that no longer fit. My new apartment was modest, just a small place on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a space where I could start fresh. The first few nights there were quiet, almost too quiet. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside. It was strange, being alone after so many years of sharing a bed, a home, a life with someone else. The loneliness was palpable, a constant presence that I had to learn to live with. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to settle into my new routine. The apartment slowly started to feel like home as I filled it with my belongings, added personal touches, and made it my own. I found solace in the small things, decorating the living room, cooking simple meals, reading books that had been collecting dust on my shelves for years. These small acts of normalcy grounded me, helped me find a sense of stability in the midst of the upheaval. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into it, taking on new projects, staying late at the office, and using it as a distraction from the emotional turmoil. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but they didn't pry. They knew what I had been through and gave me the space I needed to adjust. The daily routine of work helped me regain a sense of purpose, something to focus on beyond the pain of the past. The weekends were the hardest. Those were the days I spent with Sophie and Michael, and as much as I looked forward to seeing them, it was always bittersweet. Picking them up from the house I used to call home, seeing Emily in the doorway as they ran out to greet me, it was a reminder of the life I had lost, the family that was no longer whole. But I refused to let that sadness cloud the time I had with my children. I made sure our weekends were filled with activities, with laughter and joy. We went to the movies, visited parks, and spent hours playing board games. I wanted them to know that no matter what had happened between their mother and me, they were still the most important part of my life. It wasn't easy at first. There were awkward moments, times when they asked questions I wasn't sure how to answer, like why Mommy and Daddy couldn't just live together again. But I did my best to be honest with them, to explain things in a way they could understand. I reassured them that even though things were different now, my love for them hadn't changed, and it never would. Gradually, the new normal started to take shape. Sophie and Michael adjusted to the back and forth between their mother's house and mine, and I found comfort in the routines we established. I started to see the weekends not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as an opportunity to create something new, something just as valuable. In time, I began to reach out to friends I hadn't seen in years. My social life had taken a back seat during my marriage, and now I found myself craving connection, the kind of camaraderie that had been missing for so long. I reconnected with old college buddies, joined a local gym, and even started attending a book club that met at a nearby cafe. It was strange at first, stepping back into the social world as a single man, but it was also liberating. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had forgotten, parts that had been buried under the weight of responsibility and routine. One of the biggest challenges was learning to embrace solitude without letting it turn into loneliness. There were nights when the silence of the apartment was too much, when the memories of the past crept in, unbidden. But I learned to navigate those moments, to find peace in the quiet, and to use that time to reflect, to heal. Therapy helped. I had started seeing a counselor shortly after the separation, and those sessions became a lifeline. Dr. Harris, a calm and patient man in his 50s, helped me unpack the emotions I had been carrying, anger, grief, guilt, and guided me toward understanding and acceptance. He didn't offer quick fixes or easy answers, but he gave me the tools to cope, to move forward. Over time, I began to let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. I started to see the divorce not as a failure, but as a turning point, a necessary step in my journey towards something better. Emily and I maintained a civil relationship, mostly for the sake of the kids. We communicated regularly about their needs, their schedules, and their lives, but beyond that, we kept our distance. The anger I had once felt toward her had dulled into a kind of resigned sadness, a recognition that what was done, and that it was time to move on. We would never be friends, but we could at least be respectful co-parents, and that was enough. It wasn't until several months after the divorce that I began to entertain the idea of dating again. It felt strange, even disloyal, to consider the possibility of being with someone else. But Dr. Harris encouraged me to take things at my own pace, to explore the idea when I was ready. So I did. Tentatively at first, with a few casual dates that didn't amount to much. It was an awkward process, relearning how to connect with someone new, how to open myself up after so much pain. But then I met someone. Sarah. She was a friend of a friend. Someone I had crossed paths with at a social gathering. There was no immediate spark, no dramatic moment of realization. But over time, as we got to know each other, I found myself drawn to her. She was kind, intelligent, and had a quiet strength that I admired. We started seeing each other more often, and before long it became clear that this was something more than just casual dating. Sarah knew about my past, about the divorce, and she didn't shy away from it. She accepted me, baggage and all, and that was something I hadn't expected. It was early days, and I didn't want to rush into anything. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for me that didn't involve pain and betrayal. As my relationship with Sarah grew, so did my sense of self. I was no longer defined by the divorce, by the anger and hurt that had once consumed me. I was rebuilding, piece by piece, a new life that was my own. The process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when the past still loomed large. But I was moving forward, and that was what mattered. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment looking out over the city, I reflected on how far I had come. The man I was now was different from the man I had been a year ago, and that was okay. Life had changed me, shaped me in ways I couldn't have anticipated, but it had also given me a second chance, a chance to redefine who I was, what I wanted, and what kind of life I wanted to live. And as I sat there, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin, I realized that I was ready. Ready to let go of the past, ready to embrace the future, and ready to build something new. Not just for myself, but for my children, for the people who mattered most. This was the beginning of a new chapter, and for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful about what lay ahead. The scars of the past would always be there, a reminder of what I had been through, but they didn't define me. I was more than the sum of my pain, more than the mistakes and betrayals that had brought me here. I was ready to live again, to love again, and to find happiness in whatever form it took. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all. Not in anger, not in destruction, but in the simple, quiet act of moving forward and finding peace in the life I was creating.